Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk where I implore you to stop centralizing. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Matt Carroll. I'm a former member of the Flutter team, and for the past 4 years, I've been working as a contract developer, consultant, educator, and open source package developer and maintainer. So this is a lightning talk. It's going to be pretty quick. We're not going to get into a bunch of deep technical details here. My only goal for the next 20 minutes is to put some questions into your mind that you may not have, which hopefully will drive you to come up with some answers that maybe you also don't have yet, but allows you to accomplish more with simpler code more quickly. So first, what is centralization? We can define that in a number of ways probably, but my definition is pretty generic. To me, centralization is when multiple developers share something. And yes, that could be code, but it could also be patterns, and it could also be operational or management policy. These are things that bind us together even though we work independently. So first, let me point out that centralization is unavoidable. There's a certain amount that you're stuck with, and there's nothing you can do about it. Let's go through some examples. You're shipping a single app distribution or binary, so all your code and your fellow developers' code, all the feature team code, it goes into one place. You have to make that work. You have a central set of dependencies. You have one pub spec file with all the dependencies. Feature team A needs version 3, feature team B needs version 4. What do? You have to resolve that. You have a central set of translations in your app, all the different languages, your English, your Spanish, your German, your French. You have to make those work between all your developers and feature teams. You have a central set of assets, your images, your fonts, etc. You have a central in-app payment system. You know, when you sign up for a payment system, they ask, what's your application ID? That means all your developers, all your feature teams share that same context. And of course, we all have a single central widget tree, at least until we get to the day of multi-view, multi-window. Here's fingers crossed to that. But not only is it unavoidable, but sometimes centralization can actually be a helpful tool. Let's take a look at a few of those examples. Let's think about a central network client. If across your developers and your feature teams you have a central network client, you can create consistent protocol configuration, so you don't have to worry about developers screwing that up one by one. Similarly, if you have a common, let's say, JSON package format back and forth with your server, you can encode that in one place. You de-risk the possibility of creating bugs individually. You can create consistent error handling. So what does an error code mean via HTTP? And at that point, do you return that error code from the method, or do you throw an exception? You can make that decision at the team level if you choose. And then finally, performance optimizations. So again, with networking, there may come an opportunity to share a network connection that's already open instead of starting a new one, and you gain that with centralization. Then there's central error handlers. Now, you should handle errors where they happen, but if you also add a central error handler, you get a chance to catch anything that wasn't caught by the individual developer or feature team. And then you also have a fail-safe where when that happens, which it shouldn't, but if it does, you can report that error to your analytics system so you can then figure out where it's coming from and get it solved. And then finally, this central error handler approach doesn't require any repeated intervention by developers. You do it once and it's there for you all the time. And then central styles. So as your team gets larger and your product becomes more broad, it's really easy to start finding yourself with incompatible or different margins and border radius and colors. If you centralize styles, you take those bug opportunities away. You can also have developers who then become experts in your styles because those few developers, 1, 2, or 3 developers, own all of the styles for the app. But I would suggest to you that despite the fact that centralization is unavoidable, and despite the fact that sometimes it's helpful, most of your pain is probably caused by centralization of one form or another. So when you centralize code in general, now you're open to merge conflicts. The more you share, the more merge conflicts you're likely to have. As you have more developers with different backgrounds added to your team working on shared code, you end up with conflicting styles and patterns and packaging. Now your code is more difficult to read. And then eventually this leads to contentious code reviews where people get very defensive because they realize what you do might now make my job more difficult and vice versa. So you end up with a lot more, those code reviews take a lot longer and the team morale tends to go down. Then there's centralized data flow. Some of you might call this state management. This is a question of where you access and where you mutate data. There's some area in the middle where shared policies in that regard are acceptable, but at the extremes, when you're working on things that are simple things become more complicated because of those shared rules, and then complicated things are often hampered because you're dumbing it down to those rules. So both of those extremes tend to suffer. Centralized navigation. Flutter ships a thing called Navigator. We're going to get deeper into this issue of navigation later, but the fact that there is a Navigator widget means that Flutter gives you a centralized solution to navigation. How does that manifest? Well, you tend to get this route graph of exponentially increasing complexity because the navigation system has to solve all variations of problems, not just a narrow scope. You are limited in your visual transitions to whatever that global transition API happens to be. It's fairly generic, but I would point out, for example, that if you tried to transition between screens using a simulation instead of a tween, you might find that it's a lot more difficult, maybe even impossible, using the standard Flutter APIs. And then in terms of information hiding, let's say that you're creating screens that are really just for the work that you're doing. You can't hide them, because you need the global navigator to be able to access them at a code level. So they're public, which means now other developers on other teams might decide to use your screen. They may or may not tell you, and now you're gonna have requirements that diverge and you didn't even realize that your screen became responsible for that. So I would suggest that there is nothing more peaceful in our job than isolation. That certainly doesn't mean exciting, but it does mean peaceful. So let's look at one possible example of a problem that we might solve with this kind of decentralized, local-first approach. And the details here aren't particularly technical. This really isn't a technical problem. It's a mindset problem. It's a framing problem. What we're going to look at today is a user journey, which is to say a series of steps the user needs to move through and how we stitch those together. And most people would probably call that problem a problem of navigation. Their mind immediately goes to the global navigator, push this, pop that. We're going to take an approach that doesn't use the global navigator at all. The first thing to recognize here is that navigation isn't just one problem. In fact, let me list a number of things that most people consider part of navigation. You have the reception and parsing of deep links in mobile apps. You have the construction of an artificial history for those deep links. In the browser, you might want to focus on readable route names, and also typically in a browser, people expect that once a URL exists, it always exists, so you have to factor that into your global routing solution. Responsiveness. On a phone, often you're working with full screen navigation. You replace one screen with another. On tablets, you might have a permanently docked side menu, and navigation now means a partial view replacement, not a full screen replacement. Transition animations, I already alluded to that, but how you get from one page or one screen to another. Back behavior, what triggers it, and how do you handle it? And standard modals versus overlay, this is your typical screen versus something like an alert dialog or a bottom sheet. So most people would put all of these things under the umbrella of navigation, and frankly, there's even more beyond this. And so in Flutter, one of the most complained about areas is navigation and is Navigator. And maybe now you're starting to get a sense for why that's the case. And there's two sides to this coin. On the one hand, Flutter says, hey, we have this widget called Navigator and it does navigation. So when people say, but wait a second, there are bugs here, or they say, wait a second, it doesn't do X, Y, and Z for my navigation, that's a fair complaint because Flutter told you they solved navigation. The other side of that coin, though, is that navigation is almost one of these infinite problems. There's always another use case that hasn't been considered that someone's going to show up and demand, and when you centralize it, that new use case, to add it, it has to coexist with all other pre-existing use cases. This is how you get that exponential explosion in complexity. So I do have sympathy for the Flutter team in that regard. Let's see what it looks like to maybe solve a navigation problem in a humble, decentralized, local way. This is what we're going to try to build today. Now, the UI for this is very ugly. We could make the UI pretty on all these pages if we wanted to, but the per-page UI UX is irrelevant to how we stitch it together. So what you're looking at is a user journey to purchase movie tickets. There's some movie poster with a description. You say buy tickets, you then select your seats, you add some snacks, you enter payment details, you review your order, and then you place your order and you can add it to your Apple Wallet. Again, we're not focused on what each screen does. We just want to figure out how to stitch them together in a reasonable way. So we're going to employ what I call the flow pattern. This is something that I started doing years ago. I've implemented this for multiple clients, and it has consistently reduced the complexity of use cases that previously had a bunch of spaghetti code in kind of the global space. And phase one for a flow is to define steps. You can do this any way you'd like, but what I typically do is I just create a private enumeration. So in a file that will hold a stateful widget for the flow, I create a private enumeration. In this case, that enum has values for movie info, select seats, add snacks, enter payment details, confirm, and review every step in that flow that I showed you. And then we need to build those pages. So again, let's assume that our page widgets already exist. Now we need to build them in the flow. And that becomes as simple as a single switch statement in our build method. We switch on the current step in this stateful widget, and we just return the widget for that page. It's about as simple as it can possibly be. Now that said, we still have a glaring limitation, which is, okay, we can build the current step, but how do you go from one step to the next? All right, phase three, let's move forward through this flow. For each page, the page will have a callback that tells us when the user is done doing what the user needs to do. In this case, I can't fit all the pages here, but let's just look at select seats, the select seats page. When the user is done selecting whatever seats they want, a callback is invoked in our flow, giving us the seats, which we save, and also we then, in this call to set state, we increment the step to the next one. Our flow owns the decision about when and where we move from page to page. But at this point, with just the code that you've seen, that step, the switch statement, the callback, we can say buy tickets, go to the next screen. We can say next after selecting seats. We can say no thanks to the snacks. We can enter payment details. We can place an order, and then we're done. And for the sake of this demo, we can say done and go back to the beginning. We've assembled all of our pages. We can move through them. Now you're saying, okay, that's cute, but what if the user wants to go back or wants to cancel that process at some point in time? It's pretty easily accommodated with this pattern as well. Take that same page where we had the on seat selected, and let's add two more callbacks. One for on back, one for on cancel. Now a side note here, if back and cancel is the same throughout your entire flow, your flow widget could actually add the UI itself. But even with this simple example, the very last page where you've already placed your order, there is no going back and there is no cancel. So we can easily accommodate that by asking each page to take up the responsibility of reporting those events. But when a page says the user has expressed a desire to go back, the flow just calls set state and sets the step to the previous step, and now we're back. Cancel, we want to give the user an opportunity, make sure they know what they're doing before they cancel. So in that case, the flow will show an alert dialog that says, hey, are you sure you want to cancel this? And if the user says yes, the flow can do whatever it wants. That's actually a point where control might move outside the flow. I can't show you what the flow should do here because that's now the context of the broader app. But you can either go back to whatever happened before the flow, you can call back whoever created the flow. It's up to each individual use case. So now, with that change made, just adding a few more callbacks, we can still go forward through this whole flow. Now up here, you'll see we have a back button and we have a cancel button. So let's go back. We can go back, 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 back to the beginning. We can also go somewhere into the middle of this flow, like the snacks page. We can press the X. We get the alert dialog, which is shown by the containing flow widget, cancel the order, back to the beginning. Now even that, you're saying, okay, technically we've solved the problem. Technically we've stitched the pages together. You can put in all your information. The information is saved across pages. You can go forward, backward, cancel. But Matt, you know that no designer would ever let us publish an experience that didn't have some kind of transition. And doesn't the transition add the complexity? Don't we need to go back to the navigator now and get the routes with the transition animation? And here again, no, you don't have to do that at all. It's really not that big of a deal to solve that problem yourself as well. So this is the code that I showed a moment ago that just builds the page directly. Let's take this code here that builds the page for each step, and let's pull it into a private function and adjust the build method a bit. I've introduced a transition stack in the build method, and that transition stack just calls to that build page method down below, which still just says what step is it, here's the page. But that transition stack also asks for what is currently the top page in the stack. And I'll come back to this in just a moment, but let me show you the effect that this transition stack gives us. So we're back here in the flow, and now if I say buy tickets, there's our animation. Next, animation. No thanks, animation. If we go back, animation, animation. We now have that transition that you're used to getting in the global navigator. We can even come up here with multiple pages on this stack. We can say cancel, and they all animate out. So in this case, you might be wondering, what is this transition stack? Is this some Flutter widget I wasn't aware of? No, this is a widget that I built on the plane ride over here. So within a few hours, within a couple hundred lines of code, you can even recover the transition animation. And even though that animation wasn't impressive and it wasn't nuanced, it would be trivial to make it more impressive and more nuanced. If you wanted to kind of fade in a little bit as it slides, easily done. If you want to add a shadow, easily done. From the bottom, easily done. If you want to switch to a simulation, that's also easily done because the whole transition system itself is only a couple hundred lines. You can control every bit of it. So to recap the points here, centralization is where developers share something. It's sometimes unavoidable, it's even sometimes good. But centralization can also be a major source of pain because when you use centralized solutions, you incur centralized global problems. You're paying for the complexity of all the things you don't actually need to solve. So I suggest that you try using a humble decentralization strategy. We only looked at a navigation strategy here. We only looked at kind of a mobile app with a user journey. But you can apply this focus anywhere. Start with your problems, start with the simplest solution, and build up. If you recover back to the point where you actually do need all the centralized capabilities, that's fine. But you'll probably find that 9 times out of 10, you need 20% of what that central solution does. So thank you very much for being here at this lightning talk. I will just plug 2 things before we go. First, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific, I co-host a discussion on X/Twitter about all things Flutter and Dart. Everybody's welcome to come listen. Everybody's welcome to come join the stage and comment and ask questions. We also have featured guests whenever we can. Recently, we had Don Felker on the show. We've had members of the Flutter team. So we'd love to see you there again every Wednesday, 12 p.m. Pacific. Just follow me on X, and that's where they're announced. And then lastly, if you'd like me to help your team with contract development or consulting, check out superdeclarative.com where you can reach out to me. And finally, this presentation was built with the Flutter Deck package, an open source package to build Flutter slideshows. Not my package, but I am trying to help improve it. And so feel free to check that out on Pub and GitHub and file issues and put up PRs. So again, thank you very much.